Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. I hope you have a little bit of fun left ahead of you this summer. I do. I have a little bit of fun left. We are wrapping things up, right? So we have been talking about John Perry's dialogue on consciousness, minds, brains, and zombies. Maybe we've had our fill of zombies at this point. We are almost done talking about them. So we've been working through this book in the philosophy of mind. We got to use our Descartes knowledge to make sense of what John Perry was saying, so that was nice. We are in the third and final chapter now, right? So there was a chapter called Monday. We had a lecture on that. We had a chapter called Wednesday. I gave a lecture on that. Now we've gotten to the Friday chapter. Our characters have come together one last time, at least one last time in this week, right? This is supposed to be spring break for them. And they're going to finish their discussion, right? And so then we are going to finish our discussion as a result. Let's get reoriented. What do we need to know or remind ourselves of for the Friday chapter? Well, again, Sam Miller is really pro-dualism, right? He switched to property dualism specifically in the first chapter, the Monday chapter. And so he's been trying to argue for property dualism since then, right? And then Gretchen Weirob, she's a pretty committed physicalist. She doesn't really want to be any kind of dualist, so she is resisting, and she's letting Sam argue and just listening and seeing if she has a good rebuttal. That's the setup, right? And then we've got Dave Cohen playing this intermediary role. He can talk very easily with Gretchen about philosophical stuff because he's a philosophy student. She's a philosophy professor, as you might recall. And then Sam Miller is a minister. That's part of his interest in dualism, right? And then Dave helps Sam formulate his thoughts and create arguments to present to Gretchen, who poo-poos them, right? She doesn't accept them ultimately, but we'll see. Maybe things will change in the Friday chapter. I don't know. Okay, maybe I know. Anyway, we also need to say something specific about what happened in the Wednesday chapter because we're not quite finished with that discussion. It seemed like we were, but then one of the arguments comes up again. Okay, so in the Wednesday chapter, that was really all about this zombie argument, and the zombie argument states that we can conceive of a world that is physically indiscernible from ours. We can't tell the worlds apart physically. At an atomic level, at a macro level, they're the same. They appear the same. But in the zombie world, there aren't any experiences. There is no what it's like. There is no consciousness, right? If we really can conceive of that world, if we can get it to make sense, if it's coherent, then there's a world physically just like ours without consciousness, which suggests that consciousness isn't physical, right? And then as they kept talking about that argument, it sort of became clear that, well, in the zombie world, we wouldn't know how to account for a lot of things because in our world, those things are caused by experiences. like Dave Cohen calling the soup delicious, right? How do you like the soup, Dave? It's delicious. What is causing that in the zombie world? Aren't there a bunch of missing causes since there aren't any experiences, right? So that's a big problem. And in the Wednesday chapter, the characters seemed to agree that epiphenomenalism would fix the problem. In other words, if we admit that in this world experience doesn't cause anything, then in the zombie world, when you say the experiences aren't there, doesn't matter in terms of the causal network, right? The effects will still be there because the effects in this world aren't actually caused by experiences anyway, they just seem to be. So you can get the zombie argument to work if you accept that even in our world, experiences don't really do anything. They just accompany physical stuff, and we think they have causal efficacy, but they don't, right? And then everybody sort of is upset about the idea of phenomenalism at the end of the Wednesday chapter. So then you think the zombie argument is dead, but then appropriately, even though you thought it was dead, it's not dead, right? It's undead. Okay, so anyway, in the Friday chapter, Sam indeed tries to revive the zombie argument a bit. He brings up the notion of an innis condition once again, right? So what's an innis condition once again? It's an insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition, right? I know it's complicated. That's a lot of words. But the point in the context of the Wednesday chapter was, well, assuming Dave's taste buds and mouth are working properly, assuming his brain is working properly, and assuming he's disposed to tell the truth, his finding the soup delicious caused him to say that the soup is delicious, right? So given that he's disposed to tell the truth and his mouth is working and his taste buds are working, given that stuff, it's necessary that he actually find the soup to be delicious, that he experience it as delicious in order to then say that it's delicious, right? But then you could change that whole complex set of factors. So that complex set of factors isn't necessary, but it is sufficient. But then within the complex, it's necessary that Dave find the soup to be delicious, right? So it's a necessary but insufficient part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. I hope that's making sense at this point, if not earlier. Okay, so anyway, if we're really clear on what an innis condition is, then we know what Sam is trying to do at the beginning of the Friday chapter. He's trying to say, not every cause is an innis condition. Okay, so what's the point of saying that? Well, I'm going to focus on preemption, which is one possible way to think about this. But that seems to be the main thing that the characters are focused on, cases of preemption, right? So in the Wednesday chapter, we kept coming back to this example of a train and it gets derailed, right? So a wheel came off a freight car, right? And then there's this whole complex of factors. The train was going fast and it had to go around a curve. and the wheel came off the freight car. And so that looks like another innis condition, right? Because there are different factors that are sufficient, and within that complex set of factors, the wheel coming off is necessary. But suppose that there's a rail that's coming loose from the line, from the rail line, and that, here comes the train. It's coming down the track, and that piece of rail is pretty loose, and then the wheel comes off the freight car a nanosecond before the rail comes off the line. Okay, so then the wheel coming off isn't even necessary, right? Because if that wheel hadn't come off, the train was going to derail because of the piece of rail that was about to fall off. So, if the train had just stayed on the track another nanosecond, then that piece of rail would have come off the line, and then the train would have derailed anyway. Okay? So, in this new scenario that we're conceiving and describing, the wheel coming off preempted the rail coming off the line, acting as a cause. Does that make sense? So the one event caused a certain effect, and it preempted this other cause that would have had the same effect. It couldn't have the same effect because the effect had already occurred due to the preempting cause, right? And then, we end up getting an elaborate example of this from Gretchen. So she calls this view unnecessaryism, at least when we generalize the view. She calls it unnecessaryism, right? So we could say that in general, experiences in this world are efficacious. They do have effects, right? But then they're always preempting these other causes that would have had the same effects, right? For some reason. We don't know why yet. We could develop something, but in any case, when you generalize this idea that experiences do cause effects in our world, but they're preempting redundant causes that are then efficacious in the zombie world, right? They're preempted here, so they don't do anything here, right? But then in the zombie world, when the experiences aren't there and they're not occurring and they're not bringing about their effects, then all these redundant causes come into play. And so the very same things happen, but they're not caused by experiences. So it makes sense for Gretchen to call that unnecessaryism. It's a silly name, but it's kind of fun. So anyway, Gretchen comes up with this elaborate example of preemption to make her point. Suppose that Dave is threatened, right, for some reason. So someone shows Dave a gun before he shows up for lunch, right, and says, Dave, you better say the soup is delicious, right? I don't know if there's an explicit threat. Maybe he just points the gun, right? Maybe the implicit threat is enough. So Dave is going into the lunch ready to say that the soup is delicious because he doesn't want to get shot, right? And then there's this sort of backstory that Dave comes up with to explain what happened, right? So Gretchen is the one that comes up with the example of preemption, and it's Dave who says, "Oh, I know. This man that threatened me with a gun, he gave Gretchen the recipe, and Gretchen said she would give him $100 if I liked the soup." Right, so he really wants me to say I like the soup, so then Gretchen will give him the $100. Okay, will be all of that as it may. Let's not get too hung up on that. The point here is Dave shows up for lunch and he's ready to say the soup is delicious, regardless of how it actually tastes, right? That's the point. But then when he tastes the soup, it is actually, in fact, delicious. And so when Gretchen asks him, "What do you think of the soup?" he just spontaneously says, "Oh, it's delicious," without thinking about the threat, without thinking about the gun. That's just what he blurts out because the soup is so delicious, right? Something in him probably relaxed once he found that he liked the soup, and so he was able to forget about the threat, right? So there's preemption going on there, right? In this case, an experience is preempting some other cause. The experience of the soup as delicious is preempting the threat, keeping it from acting as a cause. That makes sense, right? There's this cause ready to spring into action. The threat is motivating, right? So it's going to bring about Dave calling the soup delicious, except that he actually finds it delicious and somewhat spontaneously blurts that out. And so that preempts the effectiveness of the threat. Okay. So basically, everybody agrees that this is coherent. Unnecessaryism is coherent, right? There could always be this preemption going on. And by the way, overdetermination is also possible. As they say, it could be that there are causes that always operate simultaneously. We don't need it to be a nanosecond before. We don't need one cause to operate a nanosecond before the other. They could always occur at the same time, and that would be overdetermination. The effects are overdetermined, but it's easier to think about preemption. Maybe it makes more intuitive sense to us, right? Maybe overdetermination seems weird. I do believe overdetermination happens, but we're not used to thinking that way. Preemption is probably easier to handle conceptually. Anyway, everyone agrees that preemption could work. Unnecessaryism, in which preemption occurs all the time, could work. Overdetermination could also work, conceivably. The problem is, as Gretchen's example shows, preemption is unusual. That's an unusual set of circumstances in which Dave finds himself, right? Where he's been threatened with a gun, and he's ready to say that the soup is delicious, and then he spontaneously says it anyway without thinking about the threat. That's elaborate, that's unusual. We don't have any reason to think that there are always these other causes waiting in the wings that get preempted by our experiences acting as causes. Okay, so you could try to develop a theory like that, but they don't do that in the text. Like you could try to come up with a reason for unnecessaryism. why are there these parallel systems of causes, and this set is always preempting this set? You could try to come up with something like that. But as it is, it looks pretty ad hoc after the fact. In other words, it looks like you're just making something up in order to get the theory to work. That's what ad hoc means here, right? So then the zombie argument finally gets put to rest, right? Because the characters agree that this solution is too ad hoc. It's not going to solve the problem. Like, it could conceptually solve the problem, but it's too much to believe that there are all these causes that are there and they're ready and they're getting preempted all the time. We don't have any reason to believe that's true. And Dave mentions anesthetics, which is an interesting point, right? So Dave says, look, the anesthetic that the dentist gives you keeps you from experiencing excruciating mouth pain, right? And then that keeps you from swearing at the dentist and, struggling to get out of the dentist's chair and like possibly hurting yourself and hurting the dentist, right? That outcome seems to be avoided because the pain was anesthetized. So that's an interesting point. It looks like the pain really does have causes in the real world. In case you were an epiphenomenalist, something to think about, right? The pain could cause writhing and tremors and all this sort of thing. We expect it would. It would cause the patient to cry out. So all of those things don't happen because the pain gets anesthetized. And then if unnecessaryism were true, it seems like if you blocked the pain, there would still be writhing and screaming and swearing at the dentist, right? Because there are these other causes waiting in the wing, supposedly, that our experiences preempt. Okay, so that's an interesting point about anesthetics, right? Okay. So speaking of, dentists, right? Now we start moving into the knowledge argument, in which the dentist Mildred plays a key role. Okay, so you will recall that at the beginning of the Wednesday chapter, Sam and Dave came in and said they had developed two arguments in favor of property dualism. So they had developed the zombie argument, and we finally just finished with that, and they had developed the knowledge argument, right? And so now that we're really done with the zombie argument, now that that zombie's really dead, we're going to move on to the knowledge argument. Okay, and then they cite Fagel, who we've mentioned before in the text, right? He's the guy behind the autocerebroscope. Okay, suppose Martians exist, intelligent Martians, somewhat humanoid Martians, and they're super intelligent and they're colorblind, and then they come to Earth and they kidnap some humans. I don't know why the example has to involve kidnapping. Can't we be at peace with the Martians and not besmirch them? But anyway, that's the example in the text. Martians kidnap humans. Like I said, they're colorblind, but they realize that humans see color, and they're trying to figure out what that means. So they study the humans intensely. They probably dissect some of them. all right, and they figure out how color vision works, right? And they know all the physical facts about how color vision works as a result of their studies, but they are colorblind. So there's something important they don't know, right? Namely, they don't know what it's like to have color vision. Okay, so there's this knowledge gap between the Martians and ourselves, and it seems like the Martians will never know what it's like to experience color vision unless they do some kind of genetic alteration to become more like humans, right? Okay, so it seems like there's a fact, right, or even various facts regarding what it's like to see in color, and I say possibly various facts because, well, there's a fact about what it's like to see green, and there's a fact about what it's like to see red, and those seem like different facts. This doesn't really come up in the text, but it's interesting to try to think about how many facts are involved here. I would say more than one. So there's something it's like to see in color. There's something it's like to see specific colors. And the Martians don't have that knowledge, and it seems like there are facts that the Martians don't have. And then it seems to follow from that, as Dave says, that there are non-physical facts at issue here, right? And then that seems to suggest that there are non-physical properties. Excuse me, I'll make a little correction. I believe Sam gets to the point of saying that there are non-physical facts at work when he initially presents the argument, and then Dave adds these non-physical facts must involve non-physical properties, which lends direct support to property dualism. Okay, so this is all meant to support property dualism, as we knew anyway. Okay, so now Dave, and I'm sure with Sam's support, right, they've been talking about these arguments together anyway. They imagine this dentist named Mildred, right? Now, Mildred has her DDS. She has her dentistry degree, her terminal degree in the field, right? So she's studied dentistry. She's grown up taking good care of her teeth. She lived in an area with naturally fluoridated water, right? So her teeth have been exposed to a lot of fluoride, and they're just really healthy and they're in good shape, right? So she's relieved a lot of tooth pain without experiencing tooth pain. That's the position Mildred is in as a well-trained practicing dentist. Okay, but also, here's this other interesting thing about her. She got her PhD in neuroscience. Okay, and to get her PhD, of course, she had to write a dissertation, and her dissertation was on the neural basis of toothaches, right? So she wanted to study tooth pain so she could better help her patients, right? So she's got this advanced degree in dentistry. She's got the standard DDS that you expect a dentist to have. She's got a PhD in neuroscience, and then her doctoral work involved examining the neural basis of tooth pain. So she knows a lot about tooth pain, right? She knows all these physical facts. And then one day she accidentally bites down on a stone and she breaks one of her teeth. And she gains some knowledge, right? Now she knows what it's like to have excruciating tooth pain. She didn't before, so she knew all the physical facts about tooth pain, but she didn't know what it's like to have tooth pain, right? And so then that seems like it must be a non-physical fact, because she knew all the physical facts, but she didn't know what it's like to have tooth pain. So then when she learns that, it seems like she's learning a non-physical fact, and then that non-physical fact we would expect involves non-physical properties, which again supports property dualism. Okay. Now Gretchen raises this point about analogous pains. Gretchen wonders whether Mildred could learn what excruciating toothaches are like by talking to her patients and comparing them to pains that she's actually had. So she might have hurt her ankle at some point. She might have had a backache at some point. Okay, and then this leaves Sam and Dave to say, well, look, toothaches are different, right? Tooth pain is a particularly bad sort of pain, and there's a particular way that it feels to have a pain in your tooth. It's different from a back pain, right? There's something about a tooth pain that's just particularly bad and throbbing. The back pain is more spasmy, and it comes and goes. There's something special about tooth pain. Okay. I don't know that she seems to be like not sure that this is true. She thinks maybe one could learn from analogy what it's like to have a terrible toothache, but she ends up granting the point to Dave and Sam anyway, maybe just so they can get on with the argument. She says, okay, fine. Maybe toothaches are so special that Mildred definitely learns something new when she has a toothache. And then Sam says, aha, basically, right? So you're granting that she learned something new. So then by granting that she learned something new, you grant that she learns a non-physical fact, which supports this point that there are non-physical properties, which supports property dualism. Okay. So now Gretchen expresses some other concerns, right? So she says that not everything one knows is a fact. That's her main point here. Right? So what does that mean? Well, if I know that George Washington was the first president of the United States of America, that's definitely a fact that I know. If I know that I'm in my office at Regis University, that's definitely a fact that I know. I also know how to ride a bike. Now, is that a fact that I know? No, I wouldn't say so. And in fact, I would be willing to grant a lot here. I would say my knowledge of how to ride a bike. I do ride my bike pretty much every day. My knowledge of how to ride a bike is not knowledge of a fact. It's not knowledge of a set of facts. It's not reducible to knowledge of some facts. It's actually, it's a little too close to what they're talking about, really, because my knowledge of how to ride a bike is largely experiential. It's also largely implicit, which is certainly different from experiential. So that's two ways in which knowing how to ride a bike is not knowledge of a fact or a set of facts. My knowledge of facts has to be explicit, otherwise I don't really know them. When I'm riding a bike, it's best not to think about it too much. Swimming is like that. Playing the piano is like that. I'm sure you can think of things that are like that. There are definitely occasions in which you want your knowledge to recede into the background so that you can focus on what you're trying to do. Like, in other words, if I'm on my bike, what am I trying to do? Well, I'm not trying to bike. I'm trying to get to Regis, say. I'm trying to get to my office. It's best to focus on that. I need to turn here. I need to go up this hill. Oh, here's a blocked street. I'll go up this street instead. Right? There's a lot of high-level thinking going on, and I'm just letting my body naturally propel myself forward on the bike. Right? So my knowledge of how to ride a bike is experiential, which is a little too close, again, to what they're talking about. So is it knowledge of physical facts, or is it knowledge of something physical, or could it be knowledge of something non-physical? Set that aside. I'm just raising that concern, right? There's an experiential aspect to my bike riding knowledge. I know that there is. I've had those experiences. It's the same with playing the piano. I can feel that my fingers are in the right position or not. I can feel them hitting the right notes or not. I often close my eyes when I'm playing the piano so I can really feel where my fingers are. There's a lot of experiential stuff going on, but again, putting that aside, that might be something for you to come back to and think about. Putting that aside, there's knowledge here about, say, where to put your feet and where to put your fingers, that we could articulate, maybe with a visual presentation better than we could articulate it with words. Maybe we could come up with a three-dimensional map and we could say, oh, here's a good spot, for your feet, and here's a good way to arrange your back to get a good posture for the bike riding. In other words, I'm willing to allow that there are some things here that maybe we could call spatial knowledge. And again, I'm going outside the text here. I'm trying to articulate things a little better than they did. They didn't really get into what kind of knowledge you have when you have knowledge of how to ride a bike. But I do think if we're trying to get away from experiential knowledge, we could say, well, there's spatial knowledge. And there's a sort of mapping that occurs. Again, there's a certain way to hold your back. There's a certain posture that works for bike riding. There's a certain way to hold your fingers to play the piano, and that could be represented in a three-dimensional map, right? And so then it wouldn't be experiential knowledge, although that's how it shows up for me, quite honestly, when I'm riding a bike or playing the piano. Anyway, the point is, not all knowledge is knowledge of facts, or at least we could say some knowledge is best represented in some form that's not verbal and propositional, and a map would be even better. Okay, I mean, I could buy all that, and so then that does create a problem at least at this point in the argument, because it's important for Dave and Sam that there's some non-physical fact that Mildred doesn't know. Their argument is hinging on it, right? They want it to be the case that there's something it's like to have a painful tooth injury, right? And there's a fact there about what it's like, and then it turns out to be a non-physical fact, and then that supports the idea that there are non-physical properties, which again directly supports property dualism. So they want there to be facts here, okay? And so, excuse me, Dave pushes on that point. This is in page 62, by the way. I keep failing to state page numbers. But if it's helpful, Dave says on page 62 that Mildred can indeed use the language of fact to talk about what she knows and what she doesn't know, what she came to know by biting down on the stone. Right now that she's having a toothache, she can say, "Oh, this tooth pain is terrible," right? She can say this experience is a painful one. The point being, this experience is painful. That is a statement. We can tell that's a statement of fact, right? So she's managed to state a fact there, right? And I already mentioned painful tooth injury as a phrase. The characters at some point start talking about PTIs, painful tooth injuries. Anyway, Dave says that Mildred is now in a position to say, "I just learned that PTI feels like this." And we should be aware that this is a demonstrative term, and it can refer to what is in your experience. So she's using this in a way that we normally use it to sort of point to some thing that we're experiencing, right? So we're experiencing tooth pain, right? And then when we talk about facts, we talk about, we use that to talk about facts. That Washington was the first president of the United States is a fact, right? That I'm on the Regis campus is a fact. So Mildred is able to use that language. She's able to use the right verbiage, right, to express a fact. That this experience is painful is a fact, she's able to say. Okay, now, normally, I already brought this up sort of inadvertently. Normally, when we say this, we say it to someone else who's experiencing the same thing. And so we are able to get the thing into view together, and so that's got some objectivity to it. I could say, "Listen to this sound." Okay. Sorry, that was weird, but my point is, that's the way we typically use the word this. We're trying to refer to a common part of our experience. I'm talking to you. I made the sound for you. We are hearing it together. So my word this is referring to that sound in virtue of our shared experience. Okay, so then my point is, Gretchen wonders whether this fact is objective, right? Facts are supposed to be objective, and the tooth pain is actually private to Mildred. I can't access her tooth pain. So isn't Mildred really talking about something subjective, not objective? Aren't facts supposed to be objective? So there's a mismatch between the privacy of Mildred's experience and then what's supposed to be the objectivity of facts, right? So then Dave helpfully imagines Sam agreeing to have his tooth injured in the same way that Mildred's is injured, right? And so then they can talk about the PTI state that they're both in, right? So Mildred could say, oh, this PTI feels terrible. And Sam can say, yes, this PTI does feel terrible, right? And then presumably they're both experiencing the same thing, so they're referring to the same thing when they say this PTI, right? I mean, that works conceptually. And then we could even use the autocerebroscope to confirm that Mildred and Sam are in the same physical brain state when they talk about this PTI, right? And then we're assuming property dualism there. Seems kind of innocuous, right? We're just saying, well, if property dualism is true, then of course physical states correspond to experiential states in a non-random way, right? The same physical states match up to the same experiential states. So we should be able to use the autocerebroscope to determine that, yeah, it makes sense for them to be talking about the same PTI, right? We're letting property dualism play itself out and entertaining, its coherence as much as we can, and it seems to pan out. It seems to work. Okay, but now I think Dave has conceded some things that are problematic. He's about to find out. Right, so Gretchen says, look, there's no reason we can't start to develop a vocabulary here, right? And we could say, okay, this kind of PTI where at some point they start talking about the lower left molar, right? So let's just go ahead and jump forward to that and say, oh, when you get a pain in your lower left molar, it's molar ouchie, right? You got the molar ouch, and and then we could have Sam do some more experiments on himself. Okay, now let's mess up your right lower molar and see if that's also molar ouchie. Oh, it is. Okay, so anyway, the point from Gretchen's point of view is, well, we can say what it's like when someone has a PTI. We could say it's molar ouchie. Right? Now we've got a word for that. So I can tell you, or Sam, who's having the experience, can tell someone else who's not having the experience, I'll tell you what it's like to have a pain in your lower left molar. It's molar ouchie, right? And so there's no problem saying what it's like. And then, not surprisingly, Sam says, well, that's a trick. People sometimes throw around words, and other people sort of nod in agreement, and they don't really know what it means. In other words, as Sam says, well, he could talk to a mathematician about complex numbers, and then he could say mid-conversation, oh, complex numbers are very interesting. But complex numbers are I should say it this way. The idea of complex numbers is an empty idea for Sam. He doesn't have mathematical training. he doesn't really know what complex numbers are. So if he were to refine his statement, he would really just say, oh, I'm interested by what you're saying. I don't fully grasp it, but I'm interested by what you're saying. Again, that term, complex numbers, it's a bit empty for him, right? And so similarly, I could say, well, this pain is very molar ouchy, and someone might go, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it's molar ouchy. And so they're throwing that phrase back at me, but for them it's empty, right? So that's fair as far as it goes. But Gretchen's not done, obviously. So now she points out that, maybe there are disciplines, whole disciplines that involve non-physical facts, right? So, it does seem to be a fact that 2 + 2 = 4. But is it a physical fact? Well, we already saw a reason in Descartes to doubt that it's a physical fact. 2 dream apples and 2 dream apples = 4 dream apples. It doesn't matter whether there's anything physically happening there. 2 + 2 = 4. That seems like a conceptual truth, an abstract truth, a non-physical truth, right? And that 9 is the square root of 81 is along the same lines. It's not really physical, is it? It's not really a physical fact. So anyway, since mathematics is so successful, can't there be a science of experiences? Can't someone get that science going, right? And we could call it qualic science, and it could be part of qualic science to say that, certain kinds of PTI are very molar ouchy, right? And so we could survey people who already have tooth pain, and we could get them to describe different aspects of their pain. How throbbing is it on a scale of 1 to 10? How piercing is it on a scale of 1 to 10? Is it a warm pain? How warm would you say on a scale of 1 to 10? Is it blunt or sharp, or there are different parameters and scales we could come up with. We could get people to catalog the experiences we're having. We could start publishing papers on this. We could get grants. We could have conferences, right? It's kind of fun to think about, right? And so qualic science could really get going. It could really take off, and we could learn a lot in the realm of qualic science. So where's all this heading? You might know from your reading, but you might have guessed anyway, right? Because of course the point is, more and more we're able to articulate and state what it's like. And if we can articulate and state it, then we can say it. We can say it to people who don't already know, who haven't already had the experience. All right, so imagine Mildred's daughter, Debbie, and Debbie kind of follows in the footsteps of her mom. She gets her DDS, so she knows how to do dentistry. She gets a neuroscience degree. She studies tooth pain like her mom did. But now qualic science has been developed quite a bit. So now it's part of the curriculum. So there's a qualic science course that Debbie has to take in order to get her neuroscience degree, right? Good. I'm glad people are taking qualic science seriously. Debbie really should study what it's like, for her patients to experience these excruciating pains. Okay. And then, of course, Debbie has been very good in taking care of her teeth, and her mom was a dentist, and so Debbie hasn't had any tooth problems, right? And then one day, Debbie's mom, Mildred, tells her about the time she bit down on a stone and she hurt her left lower molar, right? And as you might guess, Debbie says, "Oh, I know what that was like. I studied qualic science. I know what it was like when you bit down on a stone and you hurt your left lower molar, right? Left lower premolar. I'm not a dentist. I don't I don't know if the premolar is right in front of the molar. I don't know how that works exactly. So sorry. But anyway, her mom broke her left lower premolar, right? That's what it says in the text. And she was sober at the time. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't high. And she is right-handed. And so all of that indicates that Mildred's tooth injury had the qualic aspect TA-ABA, right? And so Debbie is able to tell her that, hey, I took this qualic science class, so I know if you hurt your left lower premolar and you're right-handed and you were totally sober, no drugs or alcohol in your system, yeah, you definitely would have experienced the qualic aspect TA-ABA or TA-ABA, right? And then Debbie is able to say, it would have been even worse if you had broken your right lower premolar, because then it would have had the qualic aspect, I can't speak, the qualic aspect TA-AAA, and then it would have really throbbed, right? So apparently AAA throbs more than ABA. Terrible. Nobody needs all that throbbing. So does Debbie know what she claims to know? She tells her mom, Mildred, oh, I know what that was like when you had that PTI. It was like this. And she describes it. She articulates it. So does she know what it's like or not? Does she know what she claims to know or not? Sam, of course, wants to say, well, no, Debbie doesn't know what it's like. She's saying words, but she hasn't had the experience, so she doesn't know what it's like. Okay, well, Dave realizes what's going on here. He knows what Gretchen is trying to do. So as always, he plays that translator role, right? He says, well, look, here's where we are. Qualia are supposed to be non-physical properties, right? So these non-physical facts we've been talking about, they're supposed to be constituted of qualia or qualic aspects, however we want to put that. Okay, so now we're saying Debbie doesn't actually know the non-physical facts, until she has the right experiences, right? So the same argument that was used earlier, to show that experiences are not physical, right? So in other words, sorry, I might have garbled this a little bit. In other words, earlier, Mildred knew all the physical facts, but she didn't know what it was like. And so we had to say, okay, well, then that's a non-physical fact that she didn't know, right? But now we're saying Debbie knows all the non-physical facts, and there's still something she doesn't know. So then what it's like as a non-physical fact, which seems to bring us back to it being a physical fact, right? Okay, so Does that make sense? I am going to say it again. It didn't come out 100% well the first time, and I can't redo the whole lecture at this point. Okay, so the way the argument is initially stated, that's supposed to show that there are non-physical facts with non-physical properties, is this: Mildred studies dentistry, she studies tooth pain, she studies neuroscience, she knows all the physical facts about tooth pain, but she doesn't know what it's like to have a terrible tooth injury until she bites down on a stone, right? So that's how the argument goes. And then since she knew all the physical facts and then she learns something new when she bats down on the stone, it seems like that's a non-physical fact she learns that she didn't know before, which suggests there are non-physical properties, which speaks in favor of property dualism. Okay, cue Debbie, bring in Debbie. Debbie is in a similar position. She's studied dentistry, she studied neuroscience, she studied tooth pain objectively. But then, on top of that, she's also studied qualic science, right? And in studying qualic science, she's learned the non-physical facts. She's learned what it's like, right? That's what qualia are. They're kind of the same as the what it's like aspect of things, right? So Debbie knows all the non-physical facts, but then she doesn't know what it's like to have a terrible tooth injury because she didn't bite down on a stone. That was her mom, right? So she knows the non-physical facts, but she still doesn't know what it's like. So the what it's like is non-physical, right? So then, of course, Gretchen points out that something's wrong with the argument, right? We could use the argument to show that what it's like is a non-physical fact or aspect of something. We could use the same argument to show that what it's like is a non-physical fact, which again seems to suggest it's physical. So the argument doesn't work. And then Gretchen doesn't know exactly what's wrong with the argument. She thinks that it has to do with problems with knowledge, right? Because we were already saying that, there's knowing that and there's knowing how, and those seem like different kinds of knowledge, right? And so early on, Gretchen was already worried that we didn't have a good handle on the kinds of things that can be known. And so she thinks the problem lies there. So anyway, to wrap up then, Gretchen hasn't been given a really compelling reason to adopt property dualism or to give up physicalism, right? So the zombie argument and the knowledge argument were meant to make Gretchen give up physicalism. They were both meant to show that physicalism can't account for everything, right? There's something that's left out, that's not being accounted for by physicalism, right? So in the zombie argument, the idea was experiences are non-physical because you could have a physical duplicate of this world without experiences in consciousness. So then they must be non-physical, right? And then when it comes to the knowledge argument, it seems like we could know what it's like, right? And furthermore, we could know all the physical facts about a situation and not know what it's like. So there's a gap there. But we've talked about how the arguments don't quite get us where we're trying to go. They don't quite show that something non-physical exists, so Gretchen doesn't have to give up her physicalism. But Gretchen hasn't done anything or anything much to show that there's a problem with dualism. She did point out what was wrong with substance dualism, but she hasn't really attacked property dualism. Maybe she's not able to say what's wrong with it, if anything. So then Sam can keep believing that property dualism is correct, right? And she has admitted, this is an important point for me. I mean, Gretchen has admitted, it seems to me, that whatever physical properties are responsible for the what it's like aspect of things, we don't have a good handle on those. We couldn't necessarily name them. We wouldn't necessarily recognize them if we spotted them. We wouldn't know how to spot them. So I don't think physicalism comes off really well here. Gretchen has just sort of let Sam present his arguments and then found fault. But you could imagine it going the other way, where Sam is letting Gretchen present physicalist arguments and knocking them down. I think Perry could have just as well structured the dialogue that way, and Sam could have batted down the arguments just as well. So keep that in mind. I mean, it's pretty clear that John Perry, I think it's clear that John Perry is favoring physicalism here, but he could have written the dialogue the other way around, and it could have been physicalism on the defensive, and it wouldn't really have been able to withstand a lot of critical scrutiny for the reason I already stated. We don't know which physical properties lead to consciousness, nor how they do so. So, okay, it's a draw, if you ask me. But it's been an interesting journey. Sometimes that's what philosophy is all about, having an interesting journey. I'm glad to have been on this journey with you. I thank you for your attention. Obviously, this isn't the greatest venue for a lecture ever. Not the best camera ever, not the best microphone ever. So I appreciate your bearing with me. Thank you very much.